Hey guys, Dustin here. Welcome to another episode of Horroritis. Today we're looking at Hellraiser. All 10 of them. When I first started this journey, I had planned to take a look at every movie, see how they related to each other within the shared universe, and to some extent we'll still be doing that. But there's one thing that stuck out to me that really just took up my attention while I was watching these movies. So today we'll be taking a deep dive into the Hellraiser franchise, but we'll also be looking at the slow, painful death of Pinhead. So Pinhead became the face of the Hellraiser series purely by accident. Originally, he was supposed to kind of fade away, and the character Julia from the first and second movie was supposed to become the head bad guy. However, Pinhead became a fan favorite after the first movie was released, and by the end of filming of the second movie, it was apparent that his character was much more popular than Julia's character, and by that, it changed basically the entire course that the franchise would take. If I had one criticism about the first movie, it's that we don't really know who our protagonist is, or our main characters. I mean, a lot of people will look back and they'll remember the character Kirsty, and to some extent, sure, but she actually didn't have a lot of screen time, at least in the beginning. Some people will, obviously everybody will remember the Cenobites, but they really didn't have a lot of screen time either. In fact, I think that our main characters within the first movie are actually Julia and to some extent Frank. See, Hellraiser starts off with Larry and Julia moving into Larry's old family home where his brother Frank had lived, but Frank had gone missing. It later turns out that Frank had found the puzzle box known as the Lament configuration, had solved the box, and, well, had been taken by the Cenobites. Julia, throughout the movie, is cold and distant to Larry and his daughter Kirsty. She also has resting bitch face, but I'm pretty sure that's not her fault. We learn through flashback that Julia and Frank had had an affair, pretty steamy one too, right around the time that Julia was supposed to marry Larry. So while they're moving back into the house, Larry cuts his hand and he bleeds on the floor of the room which Frank was in when he solved the box. The blood seeps into the floor and somehow regenerates Frank's body, sort of. Using Julia's feelings for him, Frank convinces her to lure people into the house and kill them so that he can use their blood to regenerate. So she starts luring guys back to the house under the guise of having sex. Soon after, Kirsty catches on and she goes to confront Julia, where she finds a very skinless and very moist Frank. She nopes the hell out of there before Frank can become the kind of uncle that we all sort of suspect him to be, and she takes the box with her, not knowing what it is or what it's for, only that it's important to Frank and he doesn't want her to take it. So Kirsty opens the box and we meet the Cenobites for the first time, learning who they are, what they're about, and they tell Kirsty that since she opened the box, she has to go with them. She decides to let them know about Frank's continued existence. They're kind of pissed off that he escaped from them, and she works out a trade where they take him instead of her. This is where Kirsty becomes our protagonist. Maybe not our main character, but definitely the character we're rooting for. So by this time, Frank has killed Larry and is currently wearing his skin. Kirsty shows back up to the house, finds the dead skinless body. She thinks that's Frank. The Cenobites say they want the man responsible for it. She thinks they want her dad, so she goes down to warn her dad, who is actually Frank wearing her dad's skin. Then she realizes it's actually Frank. He tries to attack her, but instead accidentally kills Julia. Kirsty leads him upstairs, gets him to confess who he is and what he's done. That's where the Cenobites step in and take over, and, well, they kill Frank in a way that becomes very common throughout the franchise.
Jesus wept.
After that, Kirsty uses the box to banish the Cenobites back to where they came from, and that's the end of the movie. But let's get back on Julia. In the second movie, Kirsty's in a mental institution, presumably because she told the police about what happened with her father, uncle, and stepmother, and expected them to believe it.
Wait. That mattress, you've got to destroy that mattress. See, Julia died on it, and she can come back now like Frank.
She should have known that the only believable answers are obviously swamp gas, weather balloons, mass hysteria, or too much sugar cereal. She also has a vision that she believes is her dad calling for help from hell, which makes her want to open the box so she can go in and save him. After hearing Kirsty's story and her warning to burn the mattress that Julia died on so that she can't come back, the head doctor named Channard has the mattress taken to his house because he just happens to be obsessed with the lament configuration and he wants to open the doors to hell.
Mild shock.
Using Kirsty's warning as a guide, he takes one of his patients who believes that there are bugs on him at all times, sits him on the mattress, hands him a straight razor, and says, "Go ahead and get rid of those bugs, buddy." After things go exactly the way you think they would go and things get bloody, Julia comes back, and after a series of victims, she gets her skin back. At that point, Channard brings in another patient, a girl named Tiffany, who doesn't speak but is really, really good at puzzles, and he convinces her to solve the box. Another doctor named Kyle saw Julia's resurrection and goes to tell Kirsty that he saw it and now believes her. They both rush off to Channard's house after that. Tiffany opens the box. Pinhead comes out but decides not to take Tiffany because he understands that she was just the tool to open the box and that Channard was the one with the actual motivation.
It is not hands that call us. It is desire.
Julia takes Channard into the box and forces him into a larger box, which turns him into a Cenobite. Kirsty goes in to try to save Tiffany and bring her out, but by this time, Cenobite Channard has taken over the hospital. They come across Pinhead and his Cenobites, and they once again try to take Kirsty, but she reminds them that they used to be human by showing Pinhead a picture of himself that she found in Channard's things. This somehow forces them all to reconnect with their human sides, and they turn on Channard, who is much more powerful than them, and he kills them all. Tiffany and Kirsty recover the box. While Tiffany tries to close everything back up, Channard catches up with her and attempts to kill her, but just then Julia shows up and distracts Channard while Tiffany can solve the box. It turns out that Julia is actually Kirsty in Julia's skin, which Julia had lost earlier when she got sucked into a big bright void. At this point, Pinhead is dead, the Cenobites are dead, Julia's dead, Channard is dead. This should be the end of the story, but it's not. We cut to a little while later while there are moving people taking stuff out of Channard's house, and one of the moving men come across a bloody mattress. He gets sucked into the mattress, and originally, this was going to be where Julia was reborn for a second time to take on the head villain role of the series. But instead, because it turned out that she couldn't see herself being the face of a franchise where there were characters more popular than her, which makes sense, she asked that her resurrection be cut out completely, and instead we get this very hastily, very rushed, pretty shitty type of pillar coming up out of the bed with a screaming Pinhead face on it. And this is where things start to go wrong. Hell on Earth is one of the most 90s movies in the series, and you can feel it. All the Cenobites have this weird kind of cartoony, almost wacky feel to them that's pretty common in 90s horror. The entire nightclub is a pretty good example of this, and it kind of makes me wonder if anybody did any real research into what these nightclubs actually looked like. A lot of the dialogue also looks like it was added in post and not matched up very well, but We can actually look past this. It's not very jarring. There are bigger things at play in this movie. So we start with the guy being wheeled into a hospital with chains hooked into his body in a familiar fashion. There's a girl there with him. She's rushing along in with him. And our main character, whose name is Joey, she's a reporter, is also there for a completely unrelated reason. However, she sees this and attempts to talk to the girl. The girl obviously doesn't want to talk, and she runs away. So Pinhead is stuck in the pillar from the last movie still. This pillar is now an art piece owned by J.P. Monroe, who also owns the popular nightclub The Boiler Room. After getting bit by a rat that was living inside the art piece, where the box had been stuck in and was taken out by the guy from the beginning of the movie, the blood from JP's bite gets on the statue and gets sucked in, and next thing we know, Pinhead starts to reanimate a little bit. Later, after hooking up with some random girl for the club, JP tries to boot her out. She, realizing that she was just a booty call, gets pissed and starts yelling at him, but she gets too close to the statue as she does it, and what do you know, more hook chains come out and suck her in, and she gets absorbed into the statue, and boom, we get a talking Pinhead, although he is still stuck in the pillar. Meanwhile, while Joey isn't having nightmares about her dad dying in Vietnam, she's looking for the girl from the hospital at the club. The girl, Terry, eventually shows up, and wouldn't you know it, she just happens to have the box on her. They start to work together to figure out what the box is all about, and they come across Channard's notes from the last movie. They start to form a bond, and Joey invites Terry to stay with her. However, one night while Joey's out, there's a message on her answering machine that Terry hears where Joey gets a job offer in another city. Terry, being slightly damaged and mistrusting of everybody, thinks Joey's going to abandon her, so she says, "Forget that," and she runs back to her ex-boyfriend, who just happens to be J.P. Monroe. J.P. sees this as an opportunity to feed Terry to the pillar. However, Terry doesn't like that idea very much and ends up knocking out J.P. with some brass knuckles. As she's about to leave, Pinhead calls out to her and makes her pretty much the same deal he made to J.P. All she's got to do is push J.P.'s body closer to the pillar so Pinhead can absorb him, which she does. At this point, the pillar explodes and Pinhead is free, and since he's no longer tethered to the box or his human counterpart, he is free to wreak havoc in any way that he so chooses. From here, he goes on to make a slew of nonsensical Cenobites that seem to only exist to spit one-liners. Pinhead himself gets a lot more screen time in this movie, but he uses a good deal of it to come off as a less charismatic Freddy Krueger.
Shall we begin?
In the end, Pinhead goes into Joey's mind and takes the form of her father to convince her to hand over the box, because the box has to be given and can't be taken. At this point, Pinhead's human side in ghost form shows up, forcefully merges back with Pinhead, and then tells Joey to solve the box so that she can send them both to hell. She then drops the box into some wet cement at a construction site that she's walking through, and that's the end. We cut to a little while later where there's a building, presumably where she dropped the box, and somehow the building has all the designs of the Lament configuration inside of it. The cool thing about this movie is that we get a lot of screen time from Doug Bradley, and when Doug Bradley is in human form, those scenes are really, really good. The scenes where he's Pinhead aren't bad, but the writing in this movie makes him seem a little less intelligent than before, which makes him less intimidating and less scary. From this point, the cold, uninterested beast kind of just becomes a franchise boogeyman. The next movie illustrates this fairly well, while also marking the end of complex storylines throughout the franchise, even though this movie takes place in 3 separate time periods. This is also the last Hellraiser movie to ever get a theatrical release. So in the movie Bloodline, we follow the bloodline of a toy maker named La Merchant, or Merchant, throughout the rest of the movie. This is the guy who originally built the Lament configuration about 200 years ago. However, this movie starts in space about 200 years in the future. So yes, Pinhead, Leprechaun, and Jason all went to space camp together. So we meet the descendant of the toy maker in space, who tells the story of the rest of the movie, basically. So then we jump back to the past where it all started in France about 200 years ago. We learn that the box was made to very specific specifications. We also learn that the box was necessary for a spell to summon and trap a demon from hell, in this case, a hell princess named Angelique. So already I have questions. If there's specifications and a design for this box, why didn't the box already exist? Why did nobody make it before? Also, if there's a spell that requires the box should have existed at some other point in time, unless they were just throwing spells together all willy-nilly and said, hey, let's make a crazy-ass box for this one, that'd be cool. Also, Angelique is a princess of hell. In the first couple of movies, they kind of skirted around hell. Pinhead and the Cenobites were kind of outside of good and evil, heaven, hell, all of that stuff. They touched on it a little more in the third movie, but this one just basically confirms that everything is hell-based. So basically, the first chunk of this movie is set in France, where no one speaks French or has a French accent. It also sets up Angelique to be our main bad guy, and it also shows us a very young Adam Scott. Look at him. Looks like he's been playing dress-up with his dad's clothes. So cute. So present-day Angelique gets tired of Adam Scott, and she travels to America to hang out with the toy maker's descendant, who is played by the same actor. Only now, instead of being a toy maker, he's an architect. Turns out the architect has been working on something called the Elysium configuration, which is kind of like the exact opposite of the Lament configuration. It was a design made by the original toy maker to kind of undo what he had done. Although at this point, the architect doesn't really have any of that information. It's just a thing that he's working on. After finding the Lament configuration stashed inside a pillar in the basement of the building the architect built, Angelique forces a guy to solve it, thereby opening up the door to hell. Pinhead comes out, and he decides that the architect needs to complete the Elysium configuration because somehow that's going to keep the doors to hell open indefinitely, letting Pinhead come and go as he pleases. Although since the Elysium configuration was meant to undo everything the Lament configuration did, I don't really know how that's supposed to work. After a whole bunch of Cenobite shenanigans, the architect's wife gets her hands on the box, solves it, and sends everybody, including Angelique, back to hell. We shoot forward 200 years in the future, and we're in space again, where the descendant, still played by the same guy, is finishing up his story. After he solved the box in space, the Cenobites come out, and it turns out that his entire spaceship was the Elysium configuration. He uses that to capture light from the sun, which the light bounces around inside the Elysium configuration indefinitely and destroys Pinhead and all of the Cenobites, thereby wrapping everything up in a nice bow in space. This should have been the end of the franchise. Everything was wrapped up, it was put in an end. Clive Barker produced this one, as he did with all of them. He directed the first one and produced the three after, so this had Clive Barker's seal of approval. This was an approved ending. This should have been it. Pinhead is dead. We could have said that Hellraiser was a series that started strong and ended a bit campy. It made Pinhead a horror icon, which made Doug Bradley horror royalty, the likes of Robert Englund, Tony Todd, Kane Hodder, and Brad Dourif. But that didn't happen. You see, there's 200 years worth of stuff that could happen between now and the time when Pinhead bites the proverbial big one. And with opportunities like that to make money off of a big name franchise with its own loyal fan base, well, that's like blood in the water. And then the sharks came. Enter the Weinsteins. After producing Hell on Earth and Bloodline, Dimension Films decided that they were going to keep making Hellraiser movies with or without Clive Barker's blessing. And it turned out that they did it without. These next movies in the series are not Hellraiser movies. These are spare scripts that they had just lying around that they shoehorned Hellraiser elements into to help them keep the IP rights. Again, these are not Hellraiser movies. Hellraiser Inferno is probably the least Hellraiser-like movie in the entire franchise. What we have is supposed to be a detective story about a crooked detective who makes a series of bad decisions such as stealing evidence from crime scenes, doing drugs, kissing hookers on the mouth, and opening puzzle boxes. He also uses a magic trick to steal drugs from a crime scene when absolutely no one is looking, and he's terrible at it too. I mean, that move has so many tells, you should call it Tekashi 6ix9ine. I'm late for that joke, right? I knew I was late. All of those things happen within the first few minutes of the movie, and after that, it slows way down. What we get is Boone from Nightbreed being just a general garbage human, while he tracks down a criminal called the Engineer who is responsible for murdering the prostitute that he was just with. However, in the process of tracking down the Engineer starts hunting him back and implicating him in all sorts of crimes. Boone from Nightbreed is also hallucinating pretty hard the entire time, seeing Cenobites that maybe are there and maybe aren't. The Cenobites themselves look more like aliens than the disfigured humans that we're used to, and they've even got acid tongues that they use to burn fingerprints off of victims. We rarely see anything that reminds us that this is supposed to be a Hellraiser movie, and by the 30-minute mark, I was bored. Pinhead himself only gets about 5 minutes of screen time total.
Your flesh is killing your spirit.
In the end, the whole thing was just a dream anyway. Yeah, they did it. Oh, also, Karate Cowboys. In Hellraiser Hellseeker, we are treated to an opening shot of Kirsty from the first two movies, yay, and Mayhem from the Allstate commercials, driving down the street in a car. But the whole thing is short-lived when, literally 2 minutes later, the car goes off the bridge into a river and Kirsty apparently dies. Two things. One, nobody cares about Mayhem. We care about Kirsty. For a moment there, it looked like we were going to get our hero back, but apparently not. Two, everyone knows that Mayhem can't drive.
Whoopsies.
So we follow Mayhem, who has amnesia, spends a good deal of time hallucinating and slipping into alternate forms of reality, and also for some reason has 3 separate women climbing all over him despite having the disposition of a wet mop. The Cenobites at least look normal again, but it's just too bad we don't get to see any of them until like 30 minutes into the movie, and mostly it's just one weird Cenobite dude running around, killing all of Mayhem's friends and then taunting him about it. Mayhem is also hounded by 2 detectives who are never seen together until later when we find out that one actually lives on the back of the other one's head, a la Johnny Knoxville in Men in Black 2. After about 5 or 6 times of Pinhead popping up to taunt Mayhem and drop little clues here and there, we find out that the whole big thing is just one giant Jacob's Ladder ripoff. That's right, it turns out that Mayhem had given Kirsty the lament configuration so that she would solve it, unleash the Cenobites, get killed, and then he would inherit her mass inheritance because apparently her family was rich.
Is this what you want? I hope it's everything you want it to be.
Instead, Kirsty opened the box and made a deal with Pinhead that instead of taking her, she would personally deliver 5 souls, that being Mayhem, Mayhem's friend with who he was conspiring to kill Kirsty, and the 3 women that he's been smashing on the side.
No, you had a deal. But I made a better offer.
Seriously, the whole thing was just Mayhem coming to terms with his own death, much like Tim Robbins did in the Better movie that I mentioned just a minute ago. In this movie, Pinhead was there for nothing but exposition. He was a character wasted on a subpar movie that was not ready for human eyes. Hellraiser Deader, despite having a stupid name, was the only one of these movies that I actually enjoyed, or at least saw potential in. If this movie had been its own standalone movie with no Hellraiser stuff in it, and maybe a different production company behind it, this could have been a really good movie. Okay, so check this out. A tenacious reporter goes undercover in Romania to investigate rumors of a cult that can resurrect the dead, but when she gets too deep, she learns that the truth is far more terrifying than the rumors. That is a 2-sentence pitch for a movie I would definitely watch. The possibilities there are endless, okay? First, it's set in Romania, so think about that. Is it a group of vampires or witches that are bringing back the dead? Romania is so packed with superstition and lore that it could literally be anything. But instead, it's just some guy who happens to be within the Toymaker bloodline using the Lament configuration to resurrect the dead. And for some reason, Pinhead is afraid of the cult, even going so far as to tell our main character, whose name I don't remember, is it Allie, Angie, Abaddon, something. He goes so far to tell her that she is the key to stopping the cult from opening the box and entering into Pinhead's domain.
The Deaders have discovered an entry into my world, my domain. But they can only complete their journey through you.
Mind you, this is about an hour into the movie when he finally shows up, and then he doesn't come back until like the last 10 minutes of the movie. There is an entire movie in there that is no way Hellraiser related. If you take out the box, rework the ending, you have a decent movie about a cult that resurrects the dead. You've got a main character that for a period of time straddles the line between life and death, wandering around the city with a gaping knife wound bleeding all over the place. She has to come to grips with her terrible past and decide whether or not she wants to join the cult. Also, there's a subway train that functions as a portable BDSM club. Really know what's up with that. This is the closest one we get to a real movie so far. Hellraiser Hellworld is basically a slasher movie with a super predictable ending and a twist that doesn't make sense no matter what drugs you're on. Stick with me, the drugs become relevant. This movie has a few names in it, some names before their names meant anything, but names nonetheless, like Lance Henriksen, Superman, Ezekiel from The Walking Dead. The whole movie centers around a party that's based on a game that's based on Hellraiser called Hellworld. A group of players get invited to the party, and wouldn't you know it, one by one they get knocked off. Each time Pinhead showing up to drop some little quip or a one-liner like a third-rate Freddy Krueger and disappear. That's literally his only role in this movie.
This is just the beginning.
In the end, it turns out that Lance Henriksen is the killer because his son used to play the game and then committed suicide, and he blames all the other players for his son's death. The twist is that they weren't even at the party at all. Well, they started at the party, but then after they were drugged, they ended up buried in the yard in caskets, and the entire movie was basically just a giant shared hallucination that was facilitated with the use of Nokia phones. But we're not done though, because the only reason that they were found was because the ghost of the boy who had killed himself called the police and told them where to dig. Yeah.
But then how'd you find us? Who made the call?
Traced the signal right to this very spot. Damnedest thing. We'd have never have found you. Your cell phone was found up at the house. Maybe the owner made the call, but I doubt it.
But wait, there's more stuff that doesn't make sense. Like afterwards, we see Lance Henriksen in a hotel room solving the box. Pinhead and the Cenobites, my next band name, Pinhead and the Cenobites show up and Lance Henriksen is sliced to pieces. But wait, there's more. Next, we see the last two survivors driving off, presumably to start their lives anew, when the ghost of Lance Henriksen pops up in their back seat, reaches around, and grabs the steering wheel, tries to drive them off the road, and then disappears again. And then the credits roll.
Jake.
And this is where you take the drugs to forget this movie ever happened. See? I told you they were relevant. Hellraiser Revelations was rushed into production when Dimension Films realized that it needed to pump out another Hellraiser movie or it was going to lose the rights to the IP. This would be the first movie since Bloodline to be made from an actual Hellraiser script, though it did give Doug Bradley some pause when he realized that they were shooting from a first draft and there wouldn't be a second draft. And if you've ever written anything at all, you know you never work from the first draft because the first draft is always garbage. This movie kind of proves that. Later, when Doug Bradley found out that they'd be slashing the amount of money he would be making for this movie, he decided to opt out altogether, which makes this movie the first in the entire series that does not feature Doug Bradley as Pinhead. The movie starts out following two guys, Nico and Steven, on their way to Tijuana for a weekend of tequila and donkey shows. Seriously. After some drinking, casual public bathroom sex, and accidental murder, the boys come across the lament configuration. Nico, deciding he wants to push his experience to the limit, decides to solve the box. Pinhead shows up, and both boys go missing. Their belongings are shipped back to their respective parents, who, it seems, have dinner pretty regularly so they can not talk about their missing children, which is convenient so that they can all be in the same house together when all of this goes down. Among Steven's stuff is the video camera and the lament configuration, so his mom keeps watching the video so she knows literally everything that goes down. The sister comes across the box, solves the box, and then Steven shows up in the backyard, though he's kind of weird and a little bit comatose.
Steven?
They're coming.
After a homeless man shows up, who just happens to be the same homeless man who gave them the box in Mexico, Nico's dad freaks out and shoots him. But the homeless man obviously is part of something bigger, because he just keeps showing up throughout the series. He doesn't die. He actually gets up and cuts Nico's dad's face off, and then Nico's dad dies.
Close the door! Peter!
At this point, Steven is up and moving around again, gets his hands on the gun, and then shoots his own dad in the gut, and holds everybody else hostage. We learned then that when Nico opened the box, he was taken into it and, was revived later by some blood, like you do in Hellraiser. And he then tried to force Steven to pick up prostitutes to kill so that he could use the blood to regenerate. And for a minute, Steven went along with it until he didn't. And then Nico decided to take Steven's skin instead.
I've given you the shirt off my back.
No!
It's not the shirt off your back that I want.
So the Steven we've been seeing so far is basically Nico in a Steven suit. We then learn, though, that Steven, before dying, all skinless and whatnot, was able to get his hands on the box, and he opened it and was taken inside. At this point, Nico in the Steven suit forces Steven's sister to open the box, and wouldn't you know it, Pinhead shows up, and so does Steven, who is now also Pinhead.
Steven?
I think. Everyone gets sliced up or hook-chained or whatever, except for Steven's dad and sister, who end up back in the regular world after the box closes, but Steven's dad soon dies from his gunshot wound to the stomach, and I guess Steven's sister decides she's going to try to get revenge, because she then opens the box, and the credits roll. The movie altogether isn't terrible. It needs work for sure, but it's definitely not the worst entry on this list. They really tried to tie this one back into the Hellraiser lore with the blood resurrection and the skin stealing thing, and that's appreciated. I don't know if it was the makeup or the actor, but the Pinhead in this one just kind of looked like a giant baby head. And what's with Pinhead Jr.? Is that like a new Cenobite thing? Like, is the Pinhead thing a common thing and we just didn't know until now? There's literally no explanation why he's a new Pinhead. Hellraiser Judgment is the last movie in the series, and thank God for that. Pinhead is played by a different actor, still not Doug Bradley, but at least it's not babyface Pinhead. The first 10 minutes of this movie are like a Tom Six fever dream brought to you by Rob Zombie and paid for by viewers like you. It's a mishmash of blood and vomit and nudity in the most unnecessary and ungratifying way possible. You know there's a problem with your script when you jump straight to the gross out scenes and the tits. The movie's about two detectives who just happen to be brothers and one lady detective whose job it is to keep an eye on these other two detectives, and all three of them are trying to track down a serial killer who kills people based on the 10 Commandments. Because yes, this is a 7 ripoff. Let's just cut to the obvious twist. The scruffy detective is the bad guy. Aside from a brief cameo from Heather Langenkamp, there's really nothing of interest that happens in this movie at all. It's just there to pad out the space in between the parts where they try to introduce new Hellraiser lore. Apparently in this movie, technology has spoiled mankind to the point where the lament configuration no longer works. But they have a house that essentially does the same thing, though I'm not entirely sure how a house is supposed to work better than the box, considering the way they lure people to the house is they sent them written letters. I wonder how much it costs to send a letter from hell.
Come to 55 Ludovico Place. Alone. Now. A sympathetic friend.
Once at the house, there's a convoluted process for determining if you're guilty, because once again, we're on this whole morality kick about good and evil and guilty and innocent, and it's annoying so much. Either way, there's a guy called the Auditor who just happens to be Pinhead's right-hand man in this movie and gets way more screen time than Pinhead does. He hooks you up to a typewriter that uses your blood as ink and types your sins as you speak them on human flesh. Then a guy called the Assessor comes in, and his job is to eat the flesh. And then he pukes it up into a tube, and the tube goes down to the basement, where a couple naked chicks put their hands in the mushy puke to determine if you're guilty. If you're guilty, you are sent to the cleaners, who are just more topless girls, and there's a lot of spit involved that I don't understand. And then there's the butcher and also the surgeon, but they're never really clear on exactly what those guys do. And like I said, it's convoluted. But like I said, the main guy through this whole thing is the Auditor. He gets way more screen time than Pinhead. Pinhead shows up for like a shot at the beginning, a minute in the middle, and then towards the end to kind of tie the whole thing together. So let's break down the events that bring this whole mess to an end. At one point, the bad guy detective is lured to the house. He's hooked up to the typewriter and tells all of his sins. The Assessor comes in and eats the sins, but the sins are so terrible that it almost kills the Assessor. So the Auditor freaks out, sends the bad guy detective to the cleaners, where a lot of spitty stuff happens. It's super gross. And at the same time, an angel shows up and tells them that they have to let this guy go because he's important. So they let him go, and he goes back to Earth, where he uses the box to summon Pinhead to try to give up his wife and his brother, because his wife cheated on him with his brother while he was away in Iraq or Afghanistan. I think it was Iraq. Pinhead once again decides that he's going to take bad guy detective, and once again the angel shows up and says no, because the bad guy detective is actually doing work for heaven. He's out there spreading fear to keep the people in line so that they follow the rules because they're reasons. After a bunch of arguing, Pinhead says fine, sends bad guy detective back to Earth, but at a point where he gets murdered literally the second he pops back in. So the angel is mad, but Pinhead doesn't care, and Pinhead crucifies the angel, and as a punishment from God in heaven, Pinhead is made human and sent back to Earth, where he must live out the rest of his days as a homeless man.
The sweet suffering. The sweet suffering.
Aside from being a stupid ending, this directly contradicts the ending of Bloodlines, where, I mean, how can Pinhead, if he is a homeless man here, if he is human now, how can he be a Cenobite 200 years in the future in space to be killed there? The long trek from Hell Priest to homeless human was exacerbated by poor financial decisions, bad scripts, and a general lack of understanding about what made Hellraiser and Pinhead so great. Over the course of 10 movies, we watched as the unfeeling, uncaring, yet very intelligent Reaper of Flesh was slowly stripped of everything that made him scary. The once great leader of the Cenobites, at least the ones we saw, became nothing more than a boogeyman who spit out bad one-liners and little else. His focus went from being on pleasure and pain to whether or not you've been a good person. The monster who wanted nothing to do with heaven or hell became another agent bound by the rules of both. They took away his agency, and they forced him to operate within a stricter set of rules than what the box originally imposed. Instead of physical experience, he suddenly began to play mind games, hallucinations that make no sense and are altogether unnecessary from a story standpoint became his weapon of choice. By the time someone got around to trying to steer him back, the damage had been done. So that's it. That's my deep dive into the Hellraiser franchise and the long, slow, sad death of the character of Pinhead. If you like this video, give it a like, leave a comment down below. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, and BitChute. Check us out there, do what you gotta do. And that is it. So, as always, I'm Dustin, this was Horroritis, and until next time, keep it creepy.